The Titanic is remembered as a tragic symbol of romance and luxury, but the reality of daily life on board was far more suffocating. Before the iceberg ever entered the picture, passengers were already trapped in a ruthless system of extreme control and staggering corporate arrogance. Today, we are exposing 50 incredibly strict and absolutely absurd rules that governed the doomed ship. 1. If you were traveling in third class, personal hygiene was basically a competitive, high-stakes sport. There were exactly 2 bathtubs available for more than 700 lower-deck passengers. To avoid sheer anarchy in the washrooms, the White Star Line strictly enforced scheduled bathing times, meaning you had to book your quick scrub well in advance. Miss your tiny 15-minute slot, and you were out of luck for the entire transatlantic crossing. Honestly, how long could you tolerate being trapped in close quarters with hundreds of unwashed roommates before completely losing your mind? 2. First-class passengers did not simply walk down to the dining room when they felt a bit peckish. They were summoned. A dedicated crew member known as the ship's bugler would actually march through the lavish corridors playing a tune called "The Roast Beef of Old England" to signal that it was time to eat. But you couldn't just follow the music in your casual afternoon wear. You were mandated to completely change into formal evening attire first. Yes, you essentially had a musical alarm clock reminding you to put on a tuxedo just to eat a piece of fish. 3. Carrying a loaded firearm onto a modern cruise ship is unthinkable, but Edwardian rules were wildly different. First-class gentlemen were entirely allowed to bring personal revolvers on board, but the ship strictly forbade them from openly displaying the weapons in public spaces like the lounges or open decks. You were legally mandated to keep your expensive pistols securely locked inside your private cabin trunks unless an absolute emergency occurred. Essentially, a terrifying number of wealthy aristocrats were secretly sleeping next to loaded handguns. 4. Even the pets on this ship had a better social standing than half the humans on board. Wealthy passengers brought dogs that were actually issued their own tickets. However, a strict rule dictated that these pampered pooches were absolutely banned from the public lounges and dining rooms. Instead, they were confined to the ship's luxurious kennels, where the crew would walk them on the private decks. A few entitled owners secretly smuggled their tiny lapdogs into their cabins, flagrantly ignoring the captain's explicit orders to keep them out of sight. 5. If you were a woman who enjoyed a good cigar and a glass of brandy after a heavy meal, you were completely out of luck. The first-class smoking room was an exclusive sanctuary designed strictly for men to discuss politics, gamble, and avoid their spouses. Women were banned from crossing the threshold, regardless of their immense wealth or social standing. They were gently redirected to the reading room instead, where the atmosphere was aggressively polite. 6. Many incredibly wealthy travelers naturally assumed they could freely enjoy their own private vintage wine collections during the lavish evening meals. However, passengers were strictly forbidden from bringing personal liquor into the magnificent dining saloon unless they formally agreed to pay an outrageously inflated corkage fee directly to the famously strict chief steward. If a uniformed waiter caught you secretly pouring your own smuggled brandy under the table, it was confiscated immediately. They relentlessly nickel and dimed the millionaires over every sip. 7. Unmarried women traveling down in the noisy third class were strictly monitored by an official ship's matron. This incredibly stern employee was essentially a mandatory chaperone assigned to aggressively protect their vulnerable virtue from the chaotic male passengers. Single women were completely forbidden from leaving their designated sleeping quarters after dark, without the matron's explicit permission, effectively treating fully grown adult women like heavily guarded prisoners living inside a remarkably luxurious floating convent. 8. Romance in the lower decks was fiercely regulated. The ship's designers purposely separated the unmarried third-class passengers at opposite ends of the immense vessel. Single men were aggressively quarantined in the bow, right above the incredibly noisy engines, while single women and families were safely tucked away in the stern. To even attempt a secret romantic rendezvous, a young couple would have to navigate a sprawling maze of locked gates, heavily guarded corridors, and vigilant crew members who were actively paid to ruin their fun. 9. First-class passengers had exclusive access to a spectacularly ornate Turkish bath, complete with a steam room, a cooling chamber, and electric beds. However, the schedule was mercilessly segregated by gender. Women were only allowed to sweat out their champagne hangovers in the morning, while the men were granted total control of the facility for the entire afternoon and evening. If a woman desperately wanted an afternoon steam, she was simply denied entry. Would you have accepted being treated like a second-class citizen despite paying for a first-class suite? 10. Rich people packed incredibly heavy, bringing massive steamer trunks filled with multiple outfit changes for a single day. But there was a catch. Passengers were strictly forbidden from keeping large luggage in their actual cabins. Your giant trunks were relegated to the ship's massive hold, labeled either wanted or not wanted on voyage. If you urgently needed a specific diamond necklace or a velvet jacket from the hold, you couldn't just walk down there. You had to formally request a crew member to retrieve it during very specific, incredibly inconvenient hours. 11. The Titanic boasted the very first heated swimming pool on a ship, but do not assume you could simply jump in for a casual morning dip. You actually had to buy a ticket. First-class passengers were forced to pay 1 shilling, a decent chunk of change back then, just to access the water. Naturally, it was strictly segregated by gender, as men and women swimming together was considered highly scandalous. Imagine paying thousands for a luxury suite and still getting nickeled and dimed just to get your hair wet. 12. For all its unimaginable luxury and groundbreaking engineering, the ship had one shocking missing amenity. There was absolutely no passenger laundry service. Period. If you spilled rich red wine on your favorite silk gown, or somehow stained your finest tuxedo, you were completely out of luck until you reached dry land. The crew only washed the ship's massive supply of bed linens and tablecloths. Passengers were rigidly expected to either pack enough fresh clothes for the entire week or just aggressively tolerate their own lingering odors. 13. Long before the tragic disaster actually occurred, the heavy wooden lifeboats rigidly lining the upper deck were treated like highly exclusive museum pieces. Passengers were absolutely forbidden from casually leaning against them or playfully attempting to climb inside for a fun vacation photograph. Uniformed deck officers aggressively guarded these areas, strictly treating the lifeboats as delicate company property rather than vital emergency equipment. 14. Here is a rule that was actually conspicuous by its tragic absence. Passengers were never required to participate in a lifeboat drill. The captain scheduled a standard safety drill for the crew on the morning of April 14th, but then mysteriously canceled it to let people attend church services instead. The White Star Line's official policy was so wildly overconfident in their newly minted unsinkable engineering that they deemed passenger safety drills completely unnecessary. That arrogant little corporate oversight obviously proved to be a catastrophic mistake. 15. Sending a wireless telegram from the middle of the ocean was the ultimate status symbol, but it came with rigid protocols. Passengers had to fill out highly specific forms and were charged a heavy premium per word. The Marconi operators were technically there to manage ship navigation, but the rules forced them to prioritize the paid messages of first-class passengers. In fact, the operators were so overwhelmed transmitting trivial vacation gossip for the rich that they famously ignored critical ice warnings from other surrounding ships. 16. If you were traveling down in steerage, the White Star Line inherently assumed you were incapable of handling your liquor responsibly. Third-class passengers had a designated smoke room with a bar, but the bartenders operated under a very strict mandate to cut people off early. Unlike the endless flowing champagne up in the first-class lounges, the lower decks faced a hard stop on alcohol service well before midnight. The company was genuinely terrified that letting poor people drink late into the night would inevitably spark a violent uprising. 17. Getting violently seasick did not magically grant you free access to the ship's state-of-the-art medical bay. Even though you were floating miles away from civilization with nowhere else to go, the rules stated that consulting the ship's surgeon required a mandatory cash fee. Medication, fresh bandages, and even basic medical advice all cost extra. It was a ruthless, completely captive market. If you caught a nasty fever halfway across the freezing Atlantic, how much of your travel budget would you surrender just to stop shivering? 18. You would naturally think that having a comfortable place to sit on the deck of a premier ocean liner would be included in your astronomically high ticket price. You would be wrong. If a first or second class passenger wanted to lounge outside and breathe the fresh sea air, they had to formally rent a wooden deck chair from a steward for 5 extra shillings. You also had to pay to rent the thick wool blanket. The White Star Line essentially invented annoying hidden airline fees a century early. 19. The second-class library was undeniably beautiful, but it operated with the ruthless efficiency of a maximum security prison. Books were locked safely inside stunning glass-fronted mahogany cabinets, and you were absolutely not allowed to just browse. You had to explicitly request a specific title from the stern steward actively guarding the collection. Furthermore, a strict rule dictated that any book removed from the room had to be officially signed out, and damaging a single page resulted in a heavy fine added to your final travel bill. 20. Walking into the massive first-class dining saloon meant navigating a highly stressful political minefield. You were strictly forbidden from choosing your own seat. Your exact table placement was rigidly dictated by the ship's purser, based entirely on your perceived social standing, fame, and net worth. If you were deemed slightly less important, you were unceremoniously exiled to the very edges of the room. Scoring a seat at the captain's table required a formal, highly coveted invitation reserved exclusively for the absolute richest elites on board. 21. If your remarkably expensive cabin suddenly felt uncomfortably stuffy, you were strictly forbidden from simply opening the heavy glass porthole yourself to let in the fresh ocean breeze. The White Star Line explicitly mandated that only designated stewards equipped with a specialized metal key were legally authorized to unlatch the heavy brass fittings. If you arrogantly tried to force the window open with your bare hands, you would be swiftly reprimanded by the crew. It was a massive engineering marvel, yet you couldn't control your own basic airflow. 22. Wealthy Edwardians did not believe in family bonding over a fine meal. First-class children were completely banned from eating dinner in the spectacular main dining saloon with their parents. Instead, these privileged kids were strictly confined to a separate nursery dining room, where they were fed plain, unseasoned food under the watchful eye of a hired governess. The main dining room was deemed an exclusive adult sanctuary. Honestly, how much would you pay today to legally banish screaming toddlers from your luxury dinner? 23. The Titanic featured beautifully ornate electric elevators, which was a mind-blowing technological marvel at the time. However, a strict rule dictated that passengers were absolutely forbidden from operating the machinery themselves. You couldn't simply press a button to reach your floor. You had to wait for a designated, uniformed teenage lift attendant to manually close the heavy iron grills and pilot the carriage. Touching the controls yourself was considered a serious breach of ship protocol and highly dangerous. 24. The White Star Line knew their luxury lounges were absolute magnets for professional con artists and card sharks looking to fleece wealthy travelers. Instead of actually banning these criminals from boarding, the company simply posted strict warning signs. The official rule was basically, gamble at your own risk. If you ignored the plaques and lost your entire family fortune in a late-night poker game, the captain would do absolutely nothing to help you. It was essentially the Wild West, just with better tuxedos. 25. Traveling with your personal butler or maid was a massive flex, but the social hierarchy was merciless. These domestic workers were traveling on extremely expensive first-class tickets paid for by their employers, yet they were strictly forbidden from mingling in the very areas their tickets covered. The ship enforced a rule that maids and valets had to eat in their own completely separate hidden dining room to avoid making the old-money aristocrats uncomfortable. Class warfare was literally baked into the ship's blueprints. 26. Leaving your expensive jewelry casually sitting on your nightstand was a direct violation of company policy. The ship heavily enforced a rule stating that all large amounts of cash, diamonds, and important documents had to be surrendered to the ship's purser for lockup in the massive master safe. If you stubbornly kept your valuables in your luxurious suite and they mysteriously vanished, the White Star Line assumed zero legal liability. Would you trust a stranger on a giant boat with your entire family's inheritance? 27. If you wanted to buy a branded ribbon or a cute trinket to prove you sailed on the grandest ship in the world, you had to follow a bizarre retail schedule. The ship's official souvenir shop was physically located inside the first-class barber shop. The strict rule? You could only purchase souvenirs during the barber's designated working hours. If the man was busy shaving a wealthy industrialist or had closed up shop for a nap, your urgent desire to buy a commemorative paperweight was completely denied. 28. Getting sick on board wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a highly regulated legal matter. The ship operated under strict maritime laws, requiring any passenger who suspected they had a contagious illness to immediately report themselves to the captain. Trying to hide a nasty cough or a suspicious rash to avoid ruining your vacation was a punishable offense. If caught, you would be forcibly quarantined in the ship's hospital wing, completely locked away from the rest of society for the remainder of the transatlantic journey. 29. You might think paying thousands of dollars for a ticket gave you the right to casually chat up the captain, but the rulebook said otherwise. Passengers were strictly forbidden from speaking to the ship's officers while they were on duty, and setting foot anywhere near the navigating bridge was an absolute offense. The crew was there to operate a massive floating machine, not to entertain bored aristocrats. Trying to sneak up to the wheelhouse for a quick look around would get you aggressively escorted back to your cabin. 30. While first and second-class passengers were serenaded by a highly paid professional orchestra, third-class passengers were left to fend for themselves. The strict company rule was that the official musicians would never step foot in the lower decks. Instead, the White Star Line encouraged steerage passengers to bring their own acoustic instruments. They legally mandated a DIY entertainment policy, meaning if you wanted to dance, somebody in your incredibly crowded common room had better know how to play the bagpipes. 31. You couldn't just walk up to the ship's band and request your favorite pub song. The White Star Line strictly dictated that the orchestra could only play selections from a highly sanitized, pre-approved songbook. This massive manual contained over 300 respectable waltzes and classical tunes. If you wanted to hear a rebellious folk song or a modern ragtime beat, the musicians were contractually obligated to politely ignore your terrible taste. Imagine paying thousands for a luxury cruise only to have a corporate executive completely control your dinner playlist. 32. The ship printed its very own daily newspaper, the Atlantic Daily Bulletin, but passengers were strictly fed highly manipulated information. The official company rule dictated absolute censorship of the wireless news. The purser aggressively removed any incoming telegram reports about terrible disasters or stock market crashes. They were legally required to only print uplifting gossip, horse racing results, and high society fluff to intentionally keep the wealthy passengers completely oblivious and artificially happy. 33. Even floating in the middle of the freezing Atlantic, Sunday church was a rigidly scheduled mandate. The captain would transform the luxurious first-class dining saloon into a makeshift chapel and lead an official Anglican service. But this holy gathering was brutally exclusive. Third-class passengers were forcefully barred from crossing the threshold, legally mandated to hold their own far less glamorous prayers down in steerage. Heaven might not feature a velvet-roped VIP section, but the incredibly strict executives at the White Star Line absolutely made sure they had one. 34. The official company rulebook loudly proclaimed that crew members were absolutely forbidden from soliciting tips from passengers. Unofficially, it was an entirely different, incredibly stressful psychological game. Rich passengers were rigidly expected to hand out massive cash bribes to their stewards for fresh towels or a decent dinner service. If you blindly followed the written rules and refused to grease palms, your personal steward would mysteriously vanish. It was essentially high society extortion disguised as Edwardian politeness. 35. Wealthy elites on the boat deck could be awoken at whatever leisurely hour they pleased with a silver tray of hot tea. Down in third class, the rules were aggressively different. Stewards were explicitly ordered to march down the narrow corridors at a shockingly early hour, banging loudly on the thin doors. The company desperately wanted steerage passengers fed and completely out of the dining room to maintain their strict culinary schedule. You were on a luxury voyage. but basically still waking up to a brutal, unforgiving factory whistle. 36. You might logically assume a magnificent first-class bathtub flowed with crystal-clear spring water. In reality, the ship strictly mandated the exclusive use of heated Atlantic seawater for all bathing. Fresh water was incredibly heavy and heavily rationed by the engineers, meaning it was strictly reserved for drinking, cooking, and a tiny polite rinse afterward. Billionaires literally paid a massive fortune just to soak in sticky, salty ocean water. 37. Edwardian fashion rules were completely merciless. For a first-class gentleman, walking the open deck without a top hat or bowler was a scandalous breach of etiquette. But the second he stepped into the dining saloon, he was strictly mandated to remove it immediately. Women, ironically, were required to keep their massive, elaborate hats firmly pinned to their heads during daytime meals. Uniformed stewards actively patrolled to aggressively reprimand any industrialist who forgot to uncover his head. Could you imagine a modern waiter forcing a billionaire to remove his baseball cap? 38. Before the iceberg ruined everything, there was a fiercely strict plan for how passengers would leave the vessel in New York. First- and second-class elites were scheduled to smoothly walk off the ship directly into the welcoming heart of Manhattan. Third-class immigrants, however, were legally required to remain trapped on board. They had to wait for smaller ferry boats to transport them directly to Ellis Island for aggressive government processing. Your bank account literally dictated whether you were treated like a returning hero or a highly suspicious criminal suspect. 39. If you got uncomfortably chilly while strolling the open promenade, you couldn't just grab the warm blanket off your bed. The White Star Line strictly forbade passengers from bringing indoor cabin linens outside. If you desperately wanted to stay warm in the freezing ocean air, you had to formally rent an officially branded deck blanket for an annoying additional fee. Stewards actively patrolled the upper decks, looking for anyone trying to cheat the rigid system. They relentlessly monetized absolutely every single shiver you experienced on that incredibly cold, windswept ocean. 40. We already mentioned there was absolutely no passenger laundry service, but the strict fire safety rules made the situation even more incredibly frustrating. You were completely forbidden from bringing a personal travel iron into your luxurious stateroom. The incredibly strict company executives were terrified of an accidental electrical fire breaking out in the middle of the freezing ocean. If your remarkably expensive silk dress or tailored linen suit became hopelessly wrinkled inside your massive steamer trunk, you simply had to aggressively wear it completely crumpled in public. 41. Photography enthusiasts had access to a magnificent, state-of-the-art darkroom, but mixing your own chemical developer in your cabin was strictly forbidden due to the extreme fire hazard. You had to formally book a designated time slot with the ship's official photographer, pay a rather hefty fee, and process your personal vacation film under his incredibly watchful eye. They loved the money you spent on the hobby, but they absolutely did not trust you to handle the chemicals without accidentally burning the magnificent ship down. 42. You might naturally think examining your personal lifebelt would be highly encouraged, but the White Star Line strictly forbade passengers from ever touching them. Stowed high on top of the heavy wardrobes, these rigid cork vests were considered serious emergency equipment, and playfully trying them on was aggressively treated as blatant vandalism. You were explicitly told to leave them completely alone until the captain issued a direct emergency order. 43. We already established that wealthy passengers brought personal maids and valets, but the outdoor lounging rules for them were particularly humiliating. Even if an incredibly arrogant employer explicitly rented an expensive first-class deck chair for their personal servant to finally enjoy the sun, the servant was strictly forbidden from sitting in it. Domestic workers were rigidly mandated to either stand at perfect attention next to their seated employers or sit directly on the hard wooden deck like well-trained, obedient dogs. 44. Casually tossing an apple core or a finished cigar directly over the railing seems harmless, but it was actually a highly punishable maritime offense. The ship's officers strictly enforced a zero-tolerance policy against throwing absolutely anything overboard. The immense vessel created massive, highly unpredictable wind currents that would violently whip discarded trash right back onto the crowded lower decks, potentially injuring innocent people. If a deck steward caught you littering into the ocean, you face severe public reprimands and heavy financial fines. 45. You might assume that paying a small fortune for a respectable second-class ticket meant you could stay up late reading a good book or chatting with new friends. You would be dead wrong. The ship enforced a notoriously rigid lights-out policy. At exactly 11 o'clock at night, the stewards would march down the long corridors and systematically extinguish the electric lights in the public rooms. You were paying a serious premium for luxury travel. But the mighty White Star Line was still treating you like a misbehaving child at a remarkably strict summer camp. 46. When you suddenly hear a loud, blaring alarm on a modern cruise ship, your very first instinct is to run straight to the upper deck. On the Titanic, the strict rule was the exact opposite. Passengers were explicitly instructed to completely ignore the deafening emergency bells, as they were designated strictly for the crew's private internal communication. You were officially supposed to sit perfectly still inside your cabin and patiently wait for a steward to personally deliver your specific survival instructions. 47. Wealthy gentlemen were strictly forbidden from performing any manual labor, and that bizarrely included polishing their own shoes. If a first-class passenger was caught aggressively scrubbing his expensive leather boots in his cabin, a steward would immediately intervene. You were rigidly required to leave your dirty footwear completely outside your cabin door every single night. The official boots steward would quietly collect them, shine them to absolute perfection, and return them before dawn. God forbid a millionaire accidentally got a tiny smudge of dark polish on his own hands. 48. Enjoying your final, incredibly luxurious days at sea was always rudely interrupted by mandatory federal paperwork. Passengers were strictly forced to formally declare every single item they purchased abroad on massive, highly complicated customs forms before the ship even neared American waters. The ship's purser ruthlessly enforced this rigid rule, threatening that any undeclared silk tie or expensive bottle of perfume would result in a massive fine and instant confiscation. Would you have tried to secretly smuggle a diamond ring past these remarkably strict floating tax collectors? 49. Accidentally dropping your expensive gold pocket watch on the grand staircase was a complete bureaucratic nightmare. The ship operated a highly strict lost and found policy where any recovered item was immediately surrendered to the chief purser. To legally get it back, you couldn't just accurately describe the shiny object. You had to formally prove absolute ownership, sign a legal release form, and pay a mandatory finder's fee directly to the remarkably wealthy company just to reclaim your very own property. All right, we have successfully covered 49 points, and there is only one final rule left. But before we get to number 50, it is officially time for the final verdict. In our opinion, the award for the most unbelievable rule from today's list goes to the remarkably strict ban on touching your own personal lifebelt. Simply because aggressively criminalizing the act of preparing for a deadly emergency on a ship that famously sank is the darkest, most profoundly absurd historical irony imaginable. Do you entirely agree with our verdict? Or perhaps another incredibly arrogant rule earned that questionable honor? Let us know exactly what you think in the comments. And now, our final number. 50. When the legendary luxury ship finally struck that infamous iceberg, the bravest men on board were forced to rigidly follow the most incredibly tragic company mandate of all. The White Star Line strictly required the ship's professional musicians to immediately assemble and play upbeat, cheerful music during any major disruption to deliberately prevent widespread passenger panic. Those truly heroic men weren't just putting on a brave face. They were flawlessly executing a remarkably rigid corporate protocol right until the very bitter end. Would you have bravely kept playing your violin as the deck tilted into the dark, freezing ocean? This ship was a floating monument to extreme corporate arrogance. Do you think the tragedy could have been completely avoided if wealthy executives hadn't been so incredibly overconfident? Tell us exactly what you think in the comments below. If you want more unbelievable historical truths that expose the past, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video.